In this chapter, we're going to look at organizational change. We'll start by looking at what it is, and as we can see, it's any substantive modification to some part of the organization. We're going to look at the different areas that change affects. Organizational structure and design is everything we covered in our last chapter, the organizing function. Technology and operations is another area affected by change, as well as people. We'll look at where change comes from. We can see that it comes from both internal forces as well as external forces. So think back to the chapter on our environments. Internally, we might want to change because we are looking to change our strategy or how we're structured to be more efficient or productive. Some internal forces respond to external pressures, but external forces in the general and task environment can force us to change the way we compete. For instance, if the economy changes or socioculturally we see trends of come about that we need to modify ourselves to align with, those are forces from outside our organization forcing us to change. Change is all around us. When we talk about the planning function of management, setting goals and figuring out how we're going to achieve them, any goal we set is a change to what we're doing because we're trying to achieve something more. So any goal is an example of a change. We're going to talk also in this chapter about resistance to change and why people are resistant to change and how as managers we can go about overcoming that resistance to change. But for now, let's start with looking at the different areas of organizational change. First, let's start with organizational structure and design. As I said, that was basically the last chapter we covered, the organizing function of management. That's where we talked about how we design jobs, departmentalization, reporting relationships, how authority is distributed throughout the organization, how we coordinate, whether we have line or staff structure, basically the overall design of our organization. Another area of organizational change is in regards to technology and operations. So if we change the equipment we use, if we update the software being used, the work process or sequencing that's being used, or our control systems, that would fall under technology and operations. Lastly, we have people. Now, here we're not talking about actually changing people, like hiring and firing or promoting. We're talking about our human resources, our people, their abilities and skills, how they perform on the job, how they perceive the organization, what their expectations are of the organization, their attitudes and their values. So whenever we want to make a change with this might be the hardest one to change. Trying to get people to change the skills they use on the job, learn new abilities, increase their performance, change their perception of their jobs, of the organization, or any other aspect at work. Also changing their expectations or attitudes and values. So this can be the most difficult, and what we'll see in our next chapter or chapters to come when we talk about behavior and motivation, we'll be learning better how to do those things. Now let's distinguish between a planned change and a reactive change. A planned change is designed and implemented in an orderly and timely fashion in anticipation of future events. So when we talked about setting goals or changing the direction of the company, doing a SWOT analysis and coming up with our strategy for our business, and going forward and implementing that strategy, that would be a planned change. So if we look at our environment and we are, let's think about McDonald's. If they see that people want to have healthier meals, healthier options, they might make a planned change to change their menu to accommodate that, perhaps adding more salads or adding more options with fruit. That would be a planned change. A reactive change is something that's more piecemeal in response to events and circumstances as they develop, more of a knee-jerk reaction. For example, think about the economy taking a quick turn for the worst, and you are stuck with all sorts of inventory that you have to get rid of. Your reactive change is to find a way to unload it quickly, and maybe that's slashing the price. That is a reactive change. It's something that you're doing in response to something that's happening in the moment. Here are the steps in the change process. By following this logical and orderly sequence, we can increase our chances of having a successful change. We first start by recognizing the need for a change. It's important to establish goals for the change. If you don't have goals for the change, you might not stay on course and accomplish what you need to accomplish. Then it's important to diagnose the relevant variables, select the appropriate change technique, plan for the implementation of this change, implement, and as with every process in management, you need to evaluate and follow up to see how it went. We can look at the coronavirus outbreak and how that affected any number of businesses, but let's specifically look at higher education. So clearly, the college recognized there was a need for a change. We knew we couldn't keep having students on campus in large groups. Goals were established for the change that had to be made. The goal was to make sure that all students could finish the semester successfully. What were some of the relevant variables? Well, they had to think about the live classes that were going to now have to be online. And with some of the classes, you didn't have people teaching those classes that had necessarily any online component to begin with. One of the decisions that was made early on was to extend our spring break, allowing the professors time to figure out a plan going forward to finish the semester. In this unique situation, the selection of the appropriate change technique really was left at the discretion of the professor for each individual class. The planning for the implementation of the change also had to do with making sure everyone was aware of how this change was going to affect other areas of the college, and also how the change would affect students. Did students have reliable internet at home? Did they have devices on which to do the work? And all those different things were taken into effect. Obviously, we had to implement pretty quickly, and we will be evaluating and following up after the semester ends. That was, during the semester, this was reactive change. Now, the plan change regarding coronavirus is about looking ahead to the summer and making changes before the summer gets here for those classes. And for the summer semester, we'll follow this same change process, but the goals will be different. It's not just going to be about students being able to successfully complete the semester. It's going to be about setting up a schedule that is completely online. A lot of revenue is lost with canceling all the live classes. So how can we offer a full schedule that's completely online? Now, in the regular semester, you took classes that were never online and had to finish them online. For instance, the most difficult courses were the science courses where you had a lab that you did in person. So different things came into account for the summer change. Let's shift gears and talk about why people are so resistant to change. There are several reasons the book goes into detail on. They are uncertainty, threats to self-interest, different perceptions, and feelings of loss. So let's briefly talk about each of these so we can distinguish between them. Uncertainty about the extent and the effect of the change is certainly going to be the most common reason people resist change. It's when they have really no idea what this is going to mean. But sometimes we do know what a change is going to, what it's going to mean and how it's going to affect us. So let's look at threats to self-interest. If a change is happening at your place of business or your department, and maybe they're changing who you report to, right? Or how your department is organized, that might be a threat to your power and influence in that department. Maybe the person you were reporting to was someone you had built this relationship with over years of working with them, and now you have to start all over. That could be a reason you might resist that kind of change. Another reason people resist change is they don't perceive the change in the outcome the same as the person that wants to put that change in place. For instance, let's assume at your job you are rewarded for your efforts in a certain way. There's some sort of incentive plan in place. A manager decides they want to change that incentive plan because they think it will be better for both the business and for you. But as an employee, you look at what they're proposing and you don't think it's going to be better for you. Your perception is that you are going to be worse off with this change. So your perception doesn't have to be accurate, but if your perception is different from that of your manager that wants to put the change in place, your chances of wanting to go along with that change are going to be slim. You are going to resist that change. Lastly, we have feelings of loss. This can happen when a change disrupts social networks, changes what you're used to, how things used to be. Here at the college, we eliminated the computer science department, breaking it up and putting it in 3 different departments. Computer literacy got put into the business department. Some of the other classes were put into the art and design department, and others went to the math department. So now they were part of new departments that had different ways of doing things, and those people had to adjust to their new reality. So they would have feelings of loss because they weren't working with the same people any longer, and all their what they were familiar with had changed. It's important to note when we want to change a process or anything in our organizations, if people don't want to change, they might not make that change. And in some instances, you might not know that the change hasn't been made. But if the change hasn't been made, then the outcomes that you hoped to get from that change are also not going to be made. So the important thing to do is figure out why people would be resistant to change. This is where we have to have some empathy, put ourselves in other people's shoes, and figure out what kind of resistance we might be up against. Then we can move on to figuring out how to overcome that resistance to change. Here are some of the techniques. Participation is probably the best way to overcome resistance. No one wants to be told, here's how it's going to be, this is what the change is, and do it now. If we can involve people in the change from the beginning, if it's possible, sometimes it isn't, but if we can do that from the beginning, we might have better success in actually carrying out the change. By getting participation, people are going to become familiar with the change. They're going to be able to voice their opinion, give their input, and perhaps you come up with a better way of implementing the change. Another way is to educate the people involved in the change and communicate clearly about the change. With the coronavirus impacting higher education, the college was trying to do the best they could to communicate the changes and educate people on what was happening as best they could. Lastly, we have facilitation. This is a change process where you do one thing at a time. You don't unload 20 changes on your organization all at once. You figure out what has to be done first or second and do things one at a time or slowly at least, so that people have time to adapt to the changes as they're happening. As I said, participation is a really good way to get buy-in when there is a change, but sometimes you can't have participation. So for instance, if we have to make a change, with the coronavirus going completely online to finish out the semester, we can't discuss that. That has to happen. But what we can do is get participation with our employees and those involved with the best way to do it. Now let's look at a force field analysis. This helps managers facilitate change. If we have employees that don't want to go along with a change or are very upset about it, we might want to identify the forces that are acting both for and against a change so that we can focus our efforts on removing whatever barriers there are. So this is an example for General Motors. They want to close a plant, and the reasons they list for wanting to close the plant is that they need to cut costs. They have excess capacity. This means the plant, if it's running at all, is maybe at 10% capacity and 90% of the plant is idle, not being used. Or maybe it's 50-50, but they have other plants that are at 50-50 or less. And by closing this plant, they can move those operations to the other plant and then have closer to 100% capacity at a running plant and then shut this one down and save money. They also note that they want to close this because the facilities are outmoded. Maybe they're obsolete and would need to be updated to be efficient. The reasons against closing the plant: the union is against it because jobs will be lost. They're concerned about the workers' welfare. And they say, perhaps we need to keep this plant open because in the future, you might need this space. A force field analysis can be helpful because it identifies the reasons we want to have this change and close this plant. But it also acknowledges the reasons against closing. And what we try to show with this is that the reasons for closing, the change we want to implement, far outweigh the reasons against closing. We can address the reasons people are against this closing, perhaps by offering training and retooling for the employees that would be losing jobs, providing them with other opportunities, and also showing that by keeping this plant open, it affects our profits and losses. And if the company is making less money, it will have less money available to pay increases to our workers and also offer better benefits. Now let's look at re-engineering. Re-engineering is an organizational change, but it's really a radical change. As defined here, the radical redesign of all aspects of a business to achieve some major gains in cost, service, or time. Re-engineering becomes necessary when we enter into entropy. This means our company is in a state of decline because we haven't adapted to our environment as we need to. Let's take a look at the re-engineering process. We have to start by developing the goals and the strategy for the re-engineering effort. What is it we're trying to accomplish? What do we need to do to realign ourselves properly? Top management has to commit to this effort. This is going to be a major change to the entire organization, and top management has to show their commitment to this change for people to get on board. A sense of urgency has to be created in order to get people to move forward with the plan. And with re-engineering, since it's such a radical redesign of how we do things, we start off with a clean slate. In effect, we are recreating the organization. Organizational development is a planned, organization-wide effort managed from the top, but it's intended to increase the effectiveness of our organization through interventions in our organization's processes using behavioral science knowledge. So what does that mean? Behavioral science has to do with, if we look back to our theory chapter, human relations and organizational behavior theories. So what we're trying to do is work with our employees on the assumptions that they want to grow and develop in the organization, they want to be accepted, and that they influence how the organization works, and we as an organization influence them. Here's a sampling of the different techniques that can be used with organizational development. For instance, let's look at team building exercises. So for instance, we might take our employees out on a Saturday to some sort of outing where there's maybe a picnic and different activities that we do together. So we might set up a couple teams. There was one example I had read about where the CEO was put on one of the teams. So it was a mixture of different levels of management. They had to, they were competing to get a little toy sailboat across this lake. And when the competition started, the CEO's team's sailboat tipped over and fell, and his competitive nature, he dove into the lake and righted the ship, the little toy sailboat, so that it could continue in the competition. It showed a different side of the CEO to the employees, that he was in it with them, that he would go to great lengths to help them succeed as a team. People laughed, they bonded outside of work and got to know each other better. And that's a way that can increase the effectiveness of the entire organization. Survey feedback is another popular option for developing your organization. Sometimes they're called climate surveys. And what you're trying to do is really get the pulse of your organization and see how people feel. And you might have questions on it that ask things like, if you have an idea, does your manager listen to your idea? Do they involve you in decision making? And it gives a feel for the kinds of things that you're very satisfied with at work or that might need to be improved. So these, again, are just some of the things that can help with the effectiveness of our organization and the health of our organization. Innovation is also a change that happens in an organization. It is the managed effort by an organization to develop new products or services or new users for existing products and services. Here we're going to distinguish between radical and incremental. A radical innovation fundamentally changes the nature of competition in an industry. So this can be a new product, a new service, or a new technology developed that completely replaces the existing product, service, or technology in an industry. For instance, when DVDs came out, it replaced VHS tapes. Hopefully you know what that is. So that's an example where the new technology completely replaced the existing technology. By contrast, an incremental innovation doesn't really affect competition in an industry. It's just a modification to an existing product, service, or technology. So if you think about a car, we make incremental advances or innovations in a car, adding technology to it. The car still drives like a normal car, it just has an additional feature. So Bluetooth, having Bluetooth in a car, right? It's still a car, but it's a little perk that is now maybe available in that car. Now let's distinguish between technical and managerial innovations. A technical innovation is a change in the physical appearance or the performance of a product or service, or the process through which that product or service is manufactured. We need look no further than the devices that we are looking at this presentation on, right? If you look at your phone or your computer, think about how the inner workings, the chips and the processors have improved over time. That is a change in the physical performance of the product with a technical innovation. By contrast, a managerial innovation is a change in the management process by which products and services are conceived, built, and delivered to customers. Previous example of re-engineering would fall under managerial innovation. Lastly, let's distinguish between product and process innovations. A product innovation is a change in the physical characteristics or performance of existing products, or the creation of brand new products and services, versus a process innovation, which is a change in the way the product is manufactured, created, or distributed. So let's use an example. So developing a brand new product or service is a product innovation. But a process innovation would be if we have an existing product, but we find a new way to manufacture that product that perhaps saves us a lot of money or makes it even better than it was before. Innovation is a way for us to come up with new products, to improve our products, and hopefully become more competitive in the marketplace. But innovation is a change. So why don't all companies innovate? Following are the reasons, common reasons that we see a failure to innovate. One, sometimes we don't have the resources to innovate. Innovation is kind of a creative process. You have to think outside the box. You're coming up with something new. It's hard if you're constantly working all week and you have no spare time to think of outside the box and do other things. You might not have the resources to innovate. You might fail to recognize that there's an opportunity. If we're not looking at our environment and seeing how tastes are changing and trends are developing, we might not recognize an opportunity in sufficient time to innovate. And then there's always that resistance to change. So how can we promote innovation in our organizations? Well, if we reward innovation, that can be a very effective way of spurring people to want to innovate. We have to have a supportive organizational culture for innovation. Remember, if you're going to do something that's brand new, it's never been done, chances are there's going to be some failures. So the organizational culture has to be supportive of that. If you ask people to stick their neck out and do something completely new and different, and they fail and they get cut down because of that, they're not going to try again. So a supportive culture allows for failures and builds on them. And then also encouraging this kind of entrepreneurship in large organizations. So we're familiar with the term entrepreneurship, which is risk-taking as an individual to start your own business. Entrepreneurship is like risk-taking within a larger organization to try new things. Some of the titles here would be inventors, product champions, and sponsors. So when we talk about innovation and having a supportive culture, I like to give this example of 3M. 3M has a very supportive policy of giving people, I believe it's about 20% time. Employees are given time to develop things that they're interested in. And one of the scientists came up with this new glue. The problem was the glue didn't stick. Now, what are you going to do with a glue that doesn't stick? Instead of looking at it as a failure, they looked at it as, what can I do with a glue that doesn't stick? And $1 million industry was born. Post-it notes. Instead of looking at something as a failure, you learn from it and you try to be creative and innovate from it. So a glue that didn't stick became something that could create Post-it notes, which we all rely on to this day.